Hi everyone, Silvio from Shmavy here, and today I wanted to talk briefly about something that I hold very dear. I wanted to cover one of my favorite writers, Roger Zelazny, and the reason why I wanted to talk about him is because as much as I like new fantasy and new science fiction authors, and I really do, I uh, write reviews, I cover them. Most of what I read is newly published. That wasn't the case in the past. In the past, I pretty much all that I read was the stuff that was at my library, and like many libraries, especially in my small town. And my library was awesome. It wasn't tiny or anything. It had its priorities, and mostly what it had was classics of the genre. And now, my library didn't have works of Roger Zelazny when I started visiting it. I started to read Roger Zelazny very early because I used to live in Moscow. I spent my early childhood in Moscow, and then I moved to Croatia where I had my awesome library there. But when I was in Moscow, my pretty awesome aunt has gifted me a collection of novellas by Roger Zelazny, and it had three of his novellas bundled together along with his novel Lord of Light. And the first work of his that I ever read was um, Jack of Shadows. Now, Jack of Shadows is probably one of his least known works, but I like it all the same. It's a story about this thief, and it stuck with me because even now, years after I've read it, I can see some of the roots in it that could be found in urban fantasy of all things. And Jack of Shadows isn't really an urban fantasy novella. It's a story about a thief. He's this anti-hero, almost like a villain protagonist. He's a thief, and he has an ability to walk through shadows. As long as there is a source of light, he can walk through the shadow. And now, after reading all of the Sandman Slim novels by Richard Kadrey, shout out to Richard Kadrey, which I love his work very much. This is the way Sandman Slim's ability is described is just came straight out of Zelazny. And just tiny things like that. And I guess what I've been trying to say is I love new fantasy. I love new science fiction. I love just new genre fiction, new voices that we have, the diversity we now have that is prevalent more than ever, which is a very good thing. But I also feel like there's a bit of generational bias, and people have this, and by people, I don't, I don't mean to generalize, but I think there is this opinion that anything that's older than the 80s, excluding of course Tolkien, is derivative or just aged badly, or just too weird for the weird sake. And I don't think that's true. I think that there are some really worthwhile authors to read even today, especially today. And Zelazny is among them. Now, he's a writer who is really hard to pigeonhole into any kind of category because he wrote the vast majority of his work was written in the 60s and the 70s, and he was writing well into the 90s when he passed away, unfortunately. But his work was written during an era which was called new wave of science fiction, but I'd be hard pressed to call him science fiction. I always consider him to be speculative fiction, and I know that speculative fiction is kind of a loaded term, quote unquote. People uh, seem to think that when you describe something as speculative fiction, you think that it's too good to be science fiction or fantasy. No, for me, speculative fiction is what the word indicates. It's a work of fiction that has many different elements and stylistic choices that do not belong into any specific genre. It's fiction, it's fantastical. It also has maybe science in it, maybe not, but it goes there. And he, as I said, he's one of my favorite authors. And after reading the collection, I read Jack of Shadows. I read Creatures of Light and Darkness, which is seriously weird. It's super weird. He wrote This Immortal, which is kind of a series of short stories that has been put together in a novella later. And then I read Lord of Light, and that just blew my 13-year-old brain. It was incredible, and it kind of opened my mind to just mythology in general. As a child, I loved reading Greek myths, Nordic myths. I had many collections that had age-appropriate myths and stuff like that, but I never thought about myths as sort of this literary playing ground, and Zelazny did use them exactly in that way. He is not so much preoccupied with the accuracy. You can tell that he absolutely knows what he's pulling from. And The Lord of Light is a novel that is specifically tied to Hindu pantheon and Buddhism. But the way he does it is so unique and so interesting that it opened my mind to just myth retellings in general. It's something that I enjoy to this day. I will always make time for an Odyssey, a retelling of any kind. I will always make time for just founding of Rome, for just about any kind of myth. Arthurian myths, love them. There are a lot of bad ones, and I've read a lot of them, good ones and bad ones, and I just don't get tired of them. I mean, the Iliad also, there are so many Iliad retellings. Love them to death. Now back to the subject. What I like about Zelazny's writing, his prose, is he manages to be super witty, super concise, and the clarity of language he has, the command of language, is something to behold. He makes it so effortless, and at the same time, not at any point of the book when you're reading his work, you don't have a feeling that he's just putting on a show. He's not flaunting anything. He just says things in an incredibly fun way. Now, one of my favorite quotes is an opening line from Lord of Light, and it goes like this. His followers called him Mahasatman, and he said he was a god. He preferred to drop the Maha and the Atman, however, and called himself Sam. He never claimed to be a god, but then he never claimed not to be a god. And within the context of the novel, the main character is kind of like a perpetual reincarnation of Buddha Gautama, and he in the novel he's kind of this sort of a trickster character who speaks about enlightenment but never achieved one exactly. His status as a Buddha is purely rebellious one, and not to get into the spoilers, but still, the novel is wild. It is technically a sci-fi novel, but it's a sci-fi novel about spirituality, nature of just reincarnation, trolling. Basically, to put a summary, essentially humanity has spread across the stars. The Earth, as we know it, the humankind's home, is dead, and they reached a planet. And on this planet, the first colonizers have achieved godhood. One second. The first colonizers achieved godhood, and they kind of took the personas of Hindu pantheon and they monopolized the technology for the afterlife. So in this world, they have technology to transfer consciousness between bodies. So when someone is at the end of their lifespan, they can just use this machine to transfer their consciousness into a new cloned body. And it's super fun. There's nothing quite like it. It's very unique and it's absolutely worthwhile. And it's so straightforward in a way that I never feel when reading his work like there's any sort of ego present. And of course, speaking of his work, his magnum opus, his most famous work is probably Chronicles of Amber series. And my story with Amber was, after I had this collection of his novellas, which I reread endlessly, I spent a lot of money at a bookstore. I bought a Russian edition of The Great Book of Amber. It's this hardback edition that contains all 10 novels. And what can you say about Chronicles of Amber? It's impossible to put in a subgenre. In a way, it's interesting because when you put it against Lord of Light is a sci-fi novel with fantasy, I guess, elements to it, and Amber is that, but in reverse. Amber is a fantasy novel with some sci-fi elements to it. Again, there is no other term than speculative fiction. I could not and cannot describe it either way. It's so, again, a brief summary of Amber. Amber is a city. In a way, it's the only city, it's kind of like a nexus of reality, to say. There is an analogy that's used to describe it. So if you think about a lit match in a dark room, so the first shadow from this match roughly equals to the size of the object it's reflecting. But there are other sides, other echoes, other shadows. And the longer they go, the more distorted they become. So this is kind of like a principle in which the world of Amber works. Amber is kind of like a prime reality. And every other world, which are like essentially parallel worlds, I guess, is kind of a different version of it. And the faraway the further you go, the more different worlds and realities in it are, which is a really fun concept when you think about it. And on its own, it would be super fun, but what I really, really appreciate about his writing is his characters. The characters are just so much fun. The interaction between them, you can clearly see that he put some serious work into it. These are actual people, and one of the things that I feel classic sci-fi gets criticized for, and I think that's actually a fair criticism, is that a lot of these classic novels, and especially the ones that haven't aged too well, are too focused on ideas and not enough on characters, and characters are most often than not just plot and idea, not even plot points, plot mechanisms. They're just for the purposes of presenting an idea to the audience, which can be mind-blowing, but it's not something that you necessarily come back to. There's no interaction between people. The characters don't feel like they interact with each other well. It's not fun. And with him, you see clearly thought out worlds. World building is always on point. It's always interesting, but the characters make it all alive. And I highly recommend it. Then we have one of his later works that I also want to recommend. It's called A Night in the Lonesome October. Now, this is a very interesting one because it's a late novel in his career, but I would also say it's kind of one of his best ones, because it kind of captures something that I think came in a wave after him. It's when you read it, I had a feeling like I can actually see Neil Gaiman being inspired by this, if not writing this, because it's very much in that vein. It's this whimsical, magical realism thing that's kind of almost smug about it, but not really. A Night in the Lonesome October. It's a very unique book because, first of all, it's a book that's told written from a perspective of a dog, which is points from me for that fact alone. And then it's set in the Victorian times. It's a Victorian era novel, but the kind of the gist of it is you have these figures that very closely resemble famous literary and or historical characters from the Victorian times. So half of the fun is, since the novel is from the dog's perspective, is trying to guess who is this person. So you have this Russian monk with a pet snake, and you're like, is this Rasputin? Who is this? And okay, this is clearly Jack the Ripper, but who is that other person and this other person? It's super fun. It's kind of almost a ritual for me. Every Halloween I try to reread it. It's super fun.